Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 2 of my second video game generation retrospective, or recap series, whatever you like to call it. This will be on the Atari 2600, obviously one of history's most infamous and famous and iconic game consoles ever produced. And on a personal note, one of my favorites, largely because it was my first video game console ever, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. What we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the history, then my experiences with it, and then we'll talk about some of the games. Just some. There's a lot, just some. Now, okay, so the history of this thing. Now, if you don't know what the Atari 2600 is, where have you been? Because it's one of the most, I mean, like, even the most casual of casuals knows it as the Atari, or an Atari, which is wrong. Don't be that guy. That's a pet peeve. I hate when people do that. Like, Atari was a company. They made many different game consoles. Sega is a company. They made many different game consoles. Same with Nintendo. Many game consoles. I just hate when people say, oh, it's a Sega. Oh, it's a Nintendo. Oh, it's an Atari. Dude, it's not that hard. Learn the names. Just learn the names. But in the case of Atari, I forgive them a little bit just because it's the only Atari console that was successful. The other ones they made were all pretty much buried and dead, but the 2600 was a juggernaut of success. And when you think about it, though, its name was actually 2600 because Atari is the company. So the actual name of the console is 2600. Terrible name. Terrible name. But anyway, but yeah, it was a juggernaut success, and it was very clear in hindsight that Atari had no idea that not only was it going to be successful, but they were going to birth an industry, which I think if they had known that was going to happen, they would have made certain changes, most notably piracy control measures, quality control standards, stuff like that, because back then none of that existed. Like, when Atari made this thing, you have to understand, this is a very different mindset than we exist in now. Back then, video games were more like a fad than anything else, kind of like a meme that kind of comes and goes and holds the internet hostage for a bit and then just vanishes. Video games were like that. That's how it was supposed to be. Now they're weaved into social fabric. Now it's like movies, art, you know, and video games. Like, it's just there. It's just a thing that's accepted, you know. But back then it wasn't the case at all. And so when Atari made this thing, I'm sure they thought, all right, you know, some people will buy it and we'll just make all the games ourselves. A lot of the best games that were produced for this machine were all produced in-house at Atari. The concept of third-party developers didn't even exist yet. What ultimately happened there is Atari apparently wasn't the greatest company to work for, and they kind of burned some of the people who worked there, who went off and they created a little-known company called Activision, the world's first third-party developer. Because they had worked at Atari, they really knew how to make games for this thing, and they were just making games on their own. I think eventually Atari and Activision struck a deal for royalties and all that type of stuff, but there were plenty of companies that didn't play ball, because you couldn't force them to. Which is why you ended up with so many bad games. I mean, that's one of the reasons you ended up with so many bad games. A lot of the Atari-sanctioned ones were terrible as well, but we'll talk more about that when we do talk about games. But for now, so a little more on the history of the console itself. Now, the console was launched in September of 1977 in the United States. Probably also came out in Canada at the same time, I'm not sure though. It launched a year later in Europe and a few years later in Japan. It saw its greatest success in the United States. It was wildly popular here. The first year it existed, you basically had this model. This is the 6-switch Woody. However, this is not the heavy sixer. The heavy sixer is different than this in that the sides are much thicker. I've actually only seen one once. There is, for whatever reason, Microsoft has one at their studios in Seattle. It's just on display behind glass. So I've seen that one. That one's hard to find because it was the launch model. It was made in California before they decided to switch production down to Hong Kong to make the things cheaper to make, etc. But yeah, so that's basically where the Atari 2600 all started, man. And it was so successful to the point where people think, oh, it must have all died off with the video game crash because 1983 the crash killed everybody. You know, Atari made the 5200, they must have moved on. Eventually Atari made the 7800, they must have moved on. 2600 was actually still supported until 1992. That's a long lifespan. It was just massively successful, and it's like I said, it's a console that everyone seems to remember, even though they didn't necessarily have it. Like, this thing basically existed before I was born. I mean, yes, I was born in '86, so '92 was obviously after that, but the bulk of Atari 2600's history was from 1977 to 1983. Obviously, I had no memory of that. I didn't exist yet. But still, even without, even if I wasn't who I am, where I study video games like a lot, I think I would still know about this thing, and I'm sure a lot of you would as well. But yeah, anyway, so it did really well for them, and it was ultimately the only console Atari had that was successful, and they rode that for a long time. But moving on, let's talk more about the consoles themselves. So, like I said, this is a 6-switch model. Here we have the Vader 4-switch model, usually called that because it looks a lot like Darth Vader. Now, as far as I can tell, it had no Star Wars tie-in, even though right at the time, that's when Star Wars had come out in 1977. So you would think there would be a possibility of some sort of Lucasfilm, Atari connection there, especially because there were 3 Star Wars games on the 2600. You'd think maybe they would bundle them in or something like that. But as far as I can tell, it's just a coincidence. It just ended up looking a lot like Darth Vader unintentionally. And over here we have the Sears Telegames model, which doesn't actually say Atari on it anywhere. They changed the wood panel here to actually say Video Arcade, and then it says Telegames here. I'm not really sure what the deal with that is. I couldn't find that information, but I think what happened is at one point Sears got permission to do their own versions of the 2600. I don't think they just stole the molding and did it themselves, but if they did, it wouldn't really surprise me because a lot of that shit happened in that generation. Now, if you're curious why some of these have 4 and why I have 6, well, it was obviously cheaper to take 2 of them out, but here's what the functions of these things are. You have your power switch, you have your TV type, which this is antiquated. You have the option to switch between color and black and white. Oh yes. Because you have to remember back when the console came out, a lot of people still had black and white TVs. Then you have your difficulty A and B for players 1 and player 2. Now that's the part they stripped out, at least from here. What they would ultimately do is put them as like little switches on the back of the console. They'd move the power port up, and they'd move the position of the controller ports as well. They did that to save money on production. Now if you're curious like what it even does, back then you couldn't go into the game and just like change difficulty settings. That didn't exist yet. So what you would do is you'd literally change it on the hardware. So a good example of this would be like, imagine the game Pong, which is like a tennis game I'm sure you're familiar with. Your paddles are usually the same size, but imagine you have one player who's like really, really good at the game and you have one who's like really, really bad. The only way to possibly balance it out is to adjust the difficulty settings for each player. So the really, really bad player would get like a really big paddle, whereas the really, really good player would get like a really, really small one. So in theory, the game would be more balanced that way. Then you would have game select, which think of it as kind of like going into your game now and like selecting a mode you want to play. You couldn't select modes. The only way you could do it was with this switch. So games like Combat would have, a helicopter part, or they'd have like a boat part, or a tanks part, or stuff like that. And you would press this until you got to the part you wanted. And then there's also a game reset switch, which is just a reset switch. Although some games would actually use these to like activate parts of the game. It's very odd. But like I said, on the Vader model and on the Telegames model, they stripped those out and put them on the back. However, there are 4-switch versions of the Woody, and there are 6-switch versions of both the Vader and the Telegames model. There were a lot of versions of the 2600. There was other ones I don't have as well. Some based on the molding from the 7800. I don't have that. And then a few others as well. But another one I do have here is the Atari 2600 Junior. This came out many years later, and I think this is actually my favorite version because it's a nice, small, compact design, and it has a power LED on it, which I really appreciate because I can tell you, having grown up with the 2600, if it's not working, there's any number of reasons why it might not be working, and sometimes I don't even know if it's getting electricity or not. Whereas this will immediately tell you, because if the LED doesn't come on, then obviously it's not getting power. So that was nice. Also very reliable, although all of them are reliable. I've only had one 2600 ever not work, and when I got it, I was told it didn't work, and I wasn't able to fix it. However, I did give it to a friend with soldering skills, and he was able to fix it, so there you go. And then finally here, I have the Coleco Gemini. This was not made by Atari at all. It was made by Coleco. If you saw part 1 of this, Coleco was a company that made their own console called the ColecoVision. And they decided to make an add-on for their console that would let you play 2600 games, which is insane. But at one point, they did an even crazier thing. They said, well, fuck our console. Let's just make an Atari 2600. So that's exactly what this is. This is an Atari 2600 made by Coleco without Atari's permission. It is what it is. Here we have the basic controller for the console. I know a lot of people look at it like, oh, it's simplistic, I hate it, I don't want it. It's actually not a bad controller, man. It really isn't. You control it with like one thumb here, and then you just press the button. And obviously, it's a very simplistic scheme, and I thought it worked really well. And like growing up, you know, the games that were made for it, it works just fine. There were some games that were more adventurous, in which they would use controllers more creatively. Things like Breakout, they would actually have little paddle controllers you'd have that have like a dial on it and stuff. There were tennis games that used controllers like that. There was also some games that they couldn't just make special controllers for because that wasn't cost effective. So what they would do is they'd get more creative. Like there would be, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but there would be some games where they just like one button's just not enough. We need to be able to do something else. So what they do is they would say like, all right, well we have 2 controller ports. Presumably the player will have 2 controllers. The player will play primarily with 1 controller, but every once in a while they'll have to press the button on the other controller to make it do something. So you'd have essentially 2 controllers at the same time. I know there were some games that actually required both joysticks at the same time. Oof, fuck that. I can tell you that would actually be impossible. But it's still neat that some people got creative that way. I respect that. But yeah, man, that's you know, kind of a basic history there with the Atari 2600. Obviously a juggernaut success console. And I think now I'm going to talk about my personal experience with it. Now, as I mentioned, I was born in '86. This thing pretty much was done by '83, so I didn't have one when it was relevant. But what happened with me, and if you've seen my Genesis or SNES like recap videos, you might already know this story. Basically what happened was in '93, all my friends, my cousins, either had an SNES or a Genesis, and I'm like begging my mom. I'm like the only one who doesn't have a console. I need something. And she was like, all right, all right, all right. And she goes into her closet and brings out this cardboard box that has a 2600 in it and has like a bunch of games. And she's like, there you go, there's a game console, they're all the same thing. Obviously they're not, but it did hold me over. Like at first I was like, fuck this thing, it's just stupid, it's this old box, it sucks. But I got into it and I was like, this is actually pretty fun. There's a lot of games on that machine that are actually really cool. And I'll talk about some of them in a bit. But yeah, so I got more into the 2600, and because of that I have a special place in my heart for it. This is that same 2600 that she gave me. This is the first console I ever owned. It's still right here, still works. Yeah, and it's really very cool to still have it, you know, and to still have it be operational. But yeah, so what I would do is for the second half of '93, I played the shit out of that thing until I got the Genesis. And every once in a while I'd go back and play it because there were some games on there I just really genuinely liked to play. And because of that, I mean, obviously that gave me a childhood story with the thing, and that's not going to be the case with, I don't think, any of the other consoles in this generation. But yeah, because of that, it does kind of win me over a bit. And it's also a console that I actually think I would recommend to people. I know it's not something everyone's going to run out and get, but I can say if you are even the slightest bit interested, check it out. It's cheap. It's worthless. Nobody wants it. It's not like Nintendo or Sega stuff, you know, meaning everything that both of those companies have put out, where it's like getting really expensive and really hard to find. 2600 stuff, man, nobody wants that shit. I think that it either missed that curve, you know, because usually what fuels that kind of rise in retro sales is the generation that had them as kids wanting to rebuy them later. Atari 2600 stuff is old enough now that the generation that would have done that has either already done it or just never did it at all and doesn't care. They might have bought them all and then resold them all, because when I was a kid, you certainly couldn't find 2600 games anywhere. I know I couldn't, but that's only because they didn't sell them in Funkoland, you know, stuff like that. Like, they just didn't sell them in stores anymore. But when I was it was the late 90s, early aughts, I started going to more like toy shows and things like that, and I would find dealers that always had just boxes of 2600 stuff they could not get rid of, and that hasn't changed. You know, even now, I'll go to like retro game stores and they'll just have boxes of Atari 2600 stuff they don't know what to do with. A lot of the times, they give it away for free, and people still don't take it. So the point is, the console is essentially worthless, the games are essentially worthless, the console's also super reliable. Like I said, I only ever had one have an issue, and it ultimately was fixed by someone else. So I recommend checking it out. There's also a lot of different versions of it. Like I said, some I don't even have. But anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about some of the games before we go here. Now, I have a ton of Atari 2600 games, like way more than sitting here. Like I said, they're cheap, worthless. So I picked out just a couple of examples just to make a couple of points. This first game up is called Adventure. Now, this game is interesting because It's very similar to The Legend of Zelda, but kind of like the maximum that the Atari 2600 could have possibly done out of it. Instead of having like a cool looking figure like Link, you have like a block. That's all it is. But it's essentially that kind of dungeon explorer action adventure game. Hence the name Adventure. Breakout, which was one of my favorites as a kid. Because it used these paddle controllers, and it's a game I'm sure you're very familiar with, because a lot of these games got cloned 1,000 times over, and I'm sure you've played some variation of it. But it's like 3 colored bars, and you're supposed to like hit a ball to knock out all of the bars, and it keeps getting faster and faster and faster, and it's just a lot of fun. And it was one of the games that used one of those like tennis paddle controllers. Combat. This game is obviously a classic. This is one of the ones I was talking about where you press the the reset thing and it changes different games. It's got Tank Pong, Invisible Tank, Biplane, and Jet Fighter. I swear I played the shit out of this as a kid. It was just a lot of fun. It was a really good multiplayer game. It is multiplayer. You have to have 2 people for it to work. But it was oddly fun and oddly competitive. Donkey Kong this is a perfect example of why this generation was ridiculous. So Nintendo basically let ColecoVision make games for the Atari 2600. Meanwhile, Coleco has its own console. Like, you had all these competitors that sometimes would just get together and work together for some reason. So you had like Nintendo, Coleco, and Atari all making games for the Coleco, or for the Atari 2600, while also making the exact same game for the ColecoVision. Very weird. The game itself is the classic Donkey Kong, although the port of it is obviously nowhere near as good. This is obviously probably the most infamous game on the console. E.T. the Extraterrestrial. We all know the story with this game. Now, if you ever want to know like the real behind the scenes of this, because a lot of people are like, oh, that's the game that got buried, and Microsoft found all the copies years later. Gaming Historian, my buddy Norm, did a way more accurate video explaining that situation. The long and the short of it, the ones Microsoft found were not a secret. Atari made those public. The secret dump somewhere still has not been found. Check out Norm's video. He did a great job on it. But yeah, this game is definitely worth having just for the story behind it. It's a terrible game, and it was largely blamed for why the console failed in hindsight. And I certainly don't pin it on E.T. It's not this game's fault. But this game was a perfect representation of the arrogance that Atari went through towards the end. Long and the short of it, Atari was so sure this game was going to succeed, they ordered more copies of this game than there were Atari 2600s in existence. Think about that. More copies of this game exist than there ever were Atari 2600 consoles produced. The logic at the time was, it's going to be such a juggernaut, we're going to have to produce more consoles. Didn't work. Frogger, classic game. This one's interesting to me because Sega made it. Yeah, Sega made Frogger. It's right there on there. Sega made games for the Atari 2600. Nintendo made games for the Atari 2600. How weird is that to think about? There is one console that both of them made games for that neither of them owned. It's kind of cool. Speaking of Nintendo, Mario Brothers. Not to be confused with the NES game, Super Mario Brothers. This is the classic pipe game where you kind of jump up and you hit the turtles and they flip over and stuff. I'm sure you've seen it before. But yeah, this game is interesting because it actually appeared on all of Atari's consoles. There's a 2600 version, 5200 version, and a 7800 version. PacMan, this was right there with E.T. as far as we're going to produce this many copies of it, even though we don't have that many consoles in existence, because again, they were so sure it would succeed, because PacMan was the most popular game in the world at the time. Problem with it, much like E.T., was the developer didn't have much time to work with it. In the case of PacMan, the guy who made it just gave them the prototype and said, here, check it out, give me some feedback, and I'll get back to working on it. Atari just went ahead and produced this prototype as the game, and that's why this game is so damn bad, because it was literally the first draft of the game. Yeah, that's not a good copy of PacMan, as everyone knows. One of my favorites, Space Invaders. This is absolutely a classic game, and I'm sure you guys have all seen it. It's been parodied, of course, in Futurama and shitty movies like Pixels and stuff like that. But Space Invaders is actually a really fun game. It's really, really well done on the Atari 2600 too. And it does take advantage of the whole difficulty thing. Your little base ship can get bigger or smaller depending on how good or how bad you are at the game or how confident, etc. It's just an addictive, fun video game. And the Atari 2600 had a lot of those. Even though they were simple, I'm telling you, if you give it a chance, if you just embrace it and just kind of get into that mindset of I'm going to play something really classic tonight, kind of like the same mindset you'd have to get into to maybe watch a really old black and white movie or something like that, you're going to get your Casablancas. You're going to get these good like pieces of art that existed from another time that still hold up. And I'm telling you, I think Space Invaders is really one of them. Surround was a pretty fun game. I can't remember exactly. Oh man, I'm spacing out here. But Surround, I remember being one of my favorites as a kid. But all of a sudden, I can't really remember the details about the game. I just remember really liking it as a kid. I think, as I recall, it was kind of like Breakout a little bit, but I apologize because suddenly I can't remember the details. I just remember it being one of my favorite ones as a kid. And this one's interesting because this is proof that there is still dedication in the Atari 2600. It hasn't all gone away. Halo 2600. Obviously, this didn't come out back in the day. This is, Atari Ages is basically a port of Halo to the 2600. Now, you can't port an Xbox game to the 2600, so it's essentially, obviously, completely remade for the 2600. But yeah, you play as Master Chief and you shoot at shit. But yeah, so there is an independent scene with the 2600. And one thing that's cool about that is there's so many Atari cartridges sitting out there that it's not even like hard to make these things because there's so many junk cartridges they just use for donor cases and stuff. So very cool that there is an indie scene for this particular console. But yeah, like I said, got a ton more games, but I'm not going to go over all of them. But yeah, that's kind of it. Like I do recommend checking out 2600. They're not expensive. You can have a lot of fun with it. You do have to accept some negatives, obviously. You should clean it. I've done videos on how to clean some of these things, specifically the Telegames and the Gemini. I did when I got both of them. I did videos on them. You also have to accept that it only runs through RF, which sucks. But if you have modding skills, I think you can get composite out of it. So there's some things you have to go into when you're going to play this thing. But yeah, man, overall, I would say it's definitely a cool console to check out, or at least to have just for the sake of it. It's like the most recognized console in existence. Like even your most casual of casuals would recognize it and know what it is. Now, obviously, there's all those like flashbacks and Atari collections, and you could do that. But I'm telling you, there's just something charming, for lack of a better word, about playing it on the original hardware. But you know, you either get that or you don't. It's not for everybody. But yeah, guys, I think that's it. Thank you very much for watching this. Stay tuned to part 2, which we'll be talking about the Magnavox Odyssey 2. Thank you very much for watching again. See you later.